The standard biological paradigm treats the origin of life as a statistical anomaly, a product of random chemical collisions that eventually specialized into living forms. Metabiology proposes a different model. It argues that the emergence of living form is a lawful, continuous, and mathematical necessity. This framework introduces the principle of Panspatial Genesis. It posits that the generative conditions for lifelike organization are built intrinsically into the structure of space itself. Life is spatially licensed before it is chemically specialized. If biological organization is an inherent property of spatial geometry, we have to look past accidental chemistry and analyze the mathematical structure of space to understand our origin. The foundation of this model is Finsler coherence hyperfractal phase space, or FCHP. This is a highly structured anisotropic mathematical grid that serves as the bedrock of reality. Within this specific spatial structure, the formation of selective, self-maintaining boundaries is a direct consequence of physical laws. This diagram maps the entire metabiological framework. Starting from the bottom left at Panspatial Genesis, we can logically derive the progression of biology, moving from early physical boundaries to the scaling of cellular intelligence into consciousness. Treating space as an active, phase-regulated domain reduces the origin of life from a biological mystery to a solvable mathematical equation. This panel shows the universal boundary equation, the formal mathematical law dictating biological persistence and survival. A bounded system can only persist if its effective interior coherence, represented by psi, maintains a precise balance. The system's gain and restorative support must offset any dispersive loss or degradation. We see this enacted through gradient harvesting. A living boundary actively converts externally available asymmetry into maintained internal coherence to offset continuous dispersion. This process is compressed into a first-order threshold indicator, the boundary gradient viability invariant, or lambda. It defines the exact point where a system successfully offsets its own entropy. Being alive is the mathematical execution of maintaining an interior coherence gradient against the dispersive forces of the exterior universe. This framework rejects the sudden cell problem, the assumption that life leapt directly from inert matter to modern DNA, proteins, and full cellularity. Instead, this diagram illustrates the Genesis ladder theorem. Early life emerged progressively across a series of realization regimes, each characterized by an increasing depth of closure. The first primitive structures to satisfy these boundary laws were plasma vesicles, which instantiated selective interface dynamics and basic oscillatory stabilization. Next came mineral compartments. These provided specific geometries capable of retaining internal concentrations and harvesting environmental gradients. Eventually, amphiphilic protocells formed, offering a more persistent, chemically refined boundary stabilization. Life emerged through the progressive physical realization of boundary laws, climbing from simple geometric interfaces to complex chemical structures. Complex biology scales through the recursive interiority theorem. A system multiplies interiors within interiors, nesting boundaries to distribute maintenance and specialization without losing whole system integration. This illustration of the developmental control stack maps how these nested interiors organize. Cellular growth alone cannot generate complex spatial form. That requires overarching field regulation to guide growth towards stable geometric configurations known as target form attractors. The foundational layer is epigenetic modulation, responsible for local gene expression and local cellular identity. Above that is the bioelectric code, a privileged signaling medium using membrane potentials and ionic gradients for rapid, distributed positional control across tissues. The highest regulatory layer is hologenetic control. This enforces organism scale regulation, preserving symmetry, axes, and whole form proportionality. Within this framework, regeneration is not a separate function from development. It is the re-entry into target form dynamics, guided by the developmental memory retained within these distributed fields. DNA alone is insufficient. Anatomical form and regenerative capability rely on a continuous hierarchy of bioelectric and hologenetic control. The abstract spatial asymmetries within Finsler space directly manifest as tangible biological functions. This panel isolates the geometric grammar of life. three principal operators through which closure dynamics physically articulate living form. The first is chirality, or orientation-sensitive closure asymmetry. This dictates molecular handedness, lipid asymmetry, and left-right developmental patterning. The second is torsion, representing loop-dependent transport asymmetry. It physically drives helical biomolecular organization, cytoskeletal dynamics, and spiral growth. The third is curvature, the spatial trace of coherence concentration. This gradient organization dictates membrane bending, tissue folding, and organismal shape stabilization. The recognizable structures of life, from the twist of a DNA helix to the intricate folds of an organ, are literal physical extrusions of underlying spatial geometry. This capacity to maintain boundary conditions introduces a strict definition of cellular intelligence, the operational expression of closure-guided viability selection. Living cells constantly execute boundary decisions by selectively admitting necessary energy and actively rejecting dispersive threats. The boundary evaluates its environment to preserve internal coherence. Because the cell selects viability-relevant trajectories within its state space rather than passively reacting, agency and evaluation exist at the microscopic level, independent of complex nervous systems. Intelligence is a core property of boundary maintenance that scales upward as systems integrate. This section traces the ascent to conscious interiority, achieved when an integrated hierarchy of cellular agency becomes highly unified, temporally persistent, and self-referential. The framework culminates in the meta-operator theorem. Biology physically realizes two dynamic, universal processes in strict unity. It balances the observer function, the discrimination, filtering, and reduction of open possibility into asymmetry-bearing selections, against the consciousness operator, which drives integration, repair, and coherence restoration. Development, regeneration, intelligence, and consciousness are continuous. They are successive, lawful expressions of a single closure-guided spatial architecture.